Right, so once we have a definition for a model, for a user model, let's go back to our user resolver. Let's go ahead and implement some of these methods over here. There's quite a few things we will have to do inside of these resolvers. If you want to query the users, well, we have to make sure that you're actually authenticated. So I'm going to leave a bunch of to-dos. So the first thing we check is if the user is actually authenticated or not. The second thing we're going to work on would be the projection. Now, projection is a concept in MongoDB, and it basically refers to a technique of selecting specific fields from your database or from your collection. Now, for example, if you want to select users, we might have a query on users in GraphQL, of course. And for example, we want to select the name of those users. Now, it doesn't make sense to query the entire user object in the database because we're only asking the server for a name. So using projection, we're going to be able to efficiently select the exact fields that the client is asking for and also optimize the queries that we're making to our database. So we're going to work on that in the future. For now, I'm just going to leave a to-do note. So for the time being, we can actually do a return statement of user.find. We can pass in an empty object. And this way, we're basically going to select everything from the database. Once again, I'll leave another to-do. We're going to need to work on pagination here. Because we don't have any records yet, and because we're not going to have that many of them for now, because we're just developing, it's fine to do this, but of course in the future we're going to optimize this to do a proper pagination of the database because we don't want to return the entire set of users from the database. Now this user object is being highlighted for us. That's because we need to import it. So let's do an import of user, and we could have a named import because we conveniently defined an index.js file on the models, and we're going to import it from models. So we need to go one level up like this. So let's actually go back to the terminal. I'm going to try to do a yarn dev. Let's go back to the app and fire a query. And this way we get an empty set of users, and that's because we don't have any users in the database yet. Let's implement another resolver. So this one is going to request an individual user by ID. And the first thing we need to do is we need to actually check if the argument's ID is actually a valid object ID. And for this, we can actually do an import of Mongoose from Mongoose. So we can have a check over here if mongoose.types.objectID is valid. This is a utility method that we can actually call. In this case, we need to negate it. So for instance, if the object ID from arguments.id is not valid, in fact, we can actually just pass in the ID and destructure it from the args. So we'll check if the ID is valid. If not, we'll go ahead and throw an exception. Now, in this case, you can throw in a generic error, but there's a bunch of customized errors that we can actually use with Apollo out of the box. So if we go ahead and look for Apollo docs, we can go ahead and switch to the error handling section. This one is going to tell us about some of the common errors that you might encounter. So for example, authentication error, and this is when you're not authenticated and you're trying to access a protected route or service or resource. You might also have a forbidden error. In this case, for example, you're logged in, but you're not allowed to access a resource. And we also have a user input error as well as a generic Apollo error. In this case, I'll be using a user input error. So let me go back in here. I have an import of that exact object from Apollo Server Express. So we can actually go ahead and throw a new user input error. And we can basically say, let's inject the ID inside the string. And there might actually be security considerations about this. Now, we're going to talk about security afterwards, but for now, we're basically going to return that same ID the way that they provided us with. And we'll pass in a description. So let's say that whatever the user provided is not a valid user ID like this. So I'm just going to leave off a comment, sanitization. We're going to come back to this resolver and a bunch of other ones in the future, and we're going to fix up some of the security or performance issues, like I said, in the future. But this should be fine for now. So once we confirm that the argument is correct, and once we confirm that this is actually a valid user ID, we can actually go ahead and return user.findById. We can pass in the ID inside. Of course, in here, once again, we need to do auth, we need to do projection, because we need to check for the exact fields that the client is asking for. So for instance, they're asking for a subset of the actual user model. And of course, last up, the sanitization part belongs in here. Of course, it's useful to query users from an API, but it's also very useful to actually create them in the first place. Now, of course, in the signUp mutation, we need to check if the user is not authenticated. So leave off a comment not auth. Next up, we need to do a bunch of validation on the arguments. And this is the part that we're going to get into in the validation video. We're going to talk about that in more detail. But the last step would be to actually create the user itself. And for this, we can basically call User.create, and we can pass in the arguments inside. Now, once again, these args come from the resolver. It seems like I called them arg. In fact, this is actually args with an S. You can call them anything, but the idea is that this object contains all of the parameters passed from the client. So in this case, we could basically just call user.create. Once again, this user.create, just like user find by ID or user find with an empty object or whatever you pass in, all of these three calls are asynchronous. But because Apollo works with promises, we can actually just go ahead and return the result of that call to our resolver. Once that call is resolved, so once that promise is resolved, we're going to get a result from the server. So Apollo is going to handle promise resolution and promise rejection on its own. So we'll go ahead and do a mutation. Let's do a signUp mutation. We need to make sure that we pass in the set of required arguments. And this is what I was talking about with regards to basic validation in GraphQL. That's because we already have a user type and we already defined some fairly primitive but still pretty useful validation on the arguments. Like I said, the arguments have to comply with the types that we've defined in our schema. So for instance, the email has to be a string and the email also has to be provided, so it can be a null. And the same applies for other arguments as well. So we can go ahead and back in our browser. Let's pass in an email. I'm going to do alex@gmail.com. I'm going to pass in a username. Let's do alex12. Let's also pass in a name. This one, of course, would be Alex. And let's tap password. We can pass in a password. Let's do secret, like this. And let's see. Now we have to close this off with a pair of curly braces. We can request an ID, a name, email, what else? Username, created at perhaps. And this should basically be it for the schema. So let's try running it. And once we do, we get back an object. So it seems like it's been created in the database successfully. So back in MLab, I'll go back to our collections. I'm going to refresh the page and we should see a users collection. And in fact, we are also going to be able to see the user inside that collection as well. So we can actually expand this one and we could see that all of the fields have been initialized. So for instance, we get the email, the username, the name, as well as the password. Now, if you're paying attention, you're actually going to see that the password is stored as plain text. And this, of course, needs to be fixed. So in fact, what we need to do is we need to store a hashed password instead of the plain text password. So in order to do that, we are going to pull in another library. So if I go back to npmjs.org, and if we look for bcrypt, there's actually two variants of the same library. There's one called bcrypt, but it's more of a low-level library, and it does have quite a few dependencies that you need to install. But there's one that is pure JavaScript and it has the exact same API, but it doesn't have the environment limitations or quirks as the previous one. So we can actually go ahead and install it as a dependency. Let's do yarn add bcryptjs. We can go back to our resolver, and of course in here, what we could do is after the validation has been passed, we can actually go ahead and create a password variable. For example, we can grab the argument's password, and then of course we can call bcrypt hash function on it, right? But something like this could actually be outsourced on the model itself. So what we can do is we can actually create a method on the model. So going back to our user model, back on the schema, we can actually create a hook. So let's go ahead and reference the schema. And there's a hook that's called pre-save. And this one is going to be called before the model is saved. Now, in this case, we're actually calling create method on the user model. The create method is actually going to assign all the properties from the arguments object, and it's going to eventually call the save method. Now, this save method can actually be intercepted inside this hook over here. And actually, if you want to learn more about it, you could go back to Mongoose. Let's switch back to the documentation. And if you click on read docs, then you can switch to middleware section. And if you look for let's look for pre-save. And there you go. You could see that you have your schema. You define your schema with Mongoose, and then you call schema pre-save. And this one, like I said, is going to intercept all save calls on your model. So what we need to do is we need to pass in a callback. Let's actually copy it and we're going to paste it in as the second argument. This one is going to accept a callback called next. We're going to need to call it after we do all of our operations, which happen to be asynchronous in this case because we're going to be hashing the password. But in this case, we first of all have to do a check. So we can check if this is modified on the password field. So if the password field has been modified, then in this case, we do need to know that the password needs to be hashed. But if it's not the case, then we can simply call next ourselves. So let's in fact import hash from bcryptjs. So once hash is imported, we could actually go ahead and call the hash function, passing in this.password. Now, one word of caution is you've probably noticed that we're using a traditional function here, and you could see that by the use of the function keyword. If you were to use an arrow function instead of a regular function, the scope inside this function would actually be the outer scope in this file. And because we're using ES6 modules, the strict mode is going to be enabled by default. And because of that, this keyword inside an arrow function is actually going to be undefined. In general, if you're working in the outer scope in Node.js, this keyword is going to be a reference to the global object. And on the same note, if you're working in a browser environment, this keyword might be a reference to the window object, or once again, if you're using a strict mode, it's going to be undefined as well. So long story short, this actually needs to be a regular function. So I'm going to switch back to a normal function. And this way, this keyword is actually going to refer to the user that we're working on. So for instance, if we're calling the create method on the user model, we're creating a user, whatever user is being created or instantiated, that same user is going to be available inside of this hook. So that's why it's important to use a regular function instead of an arrow function in this use case. So when we call this is modified, the is modified is actually called on the model. When we do this.password, the password is actually accessed from the model instance. So whatever is being instantiated in this call from user.create passing the arguments. So once again, this password will be the exact same thing as args.password from our resolver in here. Now the second argument would be the salt. So we can pass something like 10 or 12. I'm going to pass in 10. And this call actually returns a promise. So we could do an await on it. In this case, we also need to put in the async keyword in front of the function. But once we do, the result will be a new password. And in fact, instead of assigning it to a variable, I'm just going to assign it directly to this.password. So once this is done, we can actually go ahead and call next. Now, because the operation of hashing a password might actually fail, what we might do instead is we might take this piece of code in here and we can actually put it inside of a try-catch statement. So if we catch an error, we could take that error and we can basically do a next on it like this. Otherwise, we can put in the same logic as before. So once the password has been hashed, the model should be successfully saved. So let's go back to the terminal. I'm going to do yarn dev. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this user because it has a plain text password. I'm going to make sure that we don't have that in our database. So back in the playground, we can actually go ahead and run the same query. Seems like the user has been created. So let's actually double check that. Refresh the page. You could see that now we get a user. But if you expand the fields, you could actually see that the password is now hashed. So we're not storing a plain text password. Instead, we're storing a hash of that password. And of course, that's going to be used for authentication in subsequent videos. And now the only thing is that back in our code over here, we don't actually need to call next. And I didn't realize it because we already have a next call after the if statement. So actually, we can either remove it from here, but I think it's better to keep it because this is going to catch all use cases, whether the password was modified or not. So we can actually remove this call of next inside the try catch. So if the try succeeds, it's going to go outside the if and it's going to call next. But if the try fails, it's going to go inside of the catch and it's going to catch it with the next call using the error object. So this is pretty much it for now. Now, of course, there's a huge topic of validation. Right now, we're not validating the input whatsoever. So the user can actually put in anything they want. So they can put in duplicate emails or duplicate usernames. They can even provide incorrect data that doesn't adhere to our business logic. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how to validate that user input in our application. So this is the next topic we're going to work on in the next video. But for the time being, I'm signing off. So this has been Code Realm with MERN Stack with GraphQL video series. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to see you in the next one. Take care. Take care.